Great. Okay, so welcome everybody to our Zoom Q seminar. This is our monthly seminar, and we have a special speaker series, as you probably saw. We're going to be meeting and hearing from the authors of Cultivating Q Methodology, and over the next year, actually. And special today, we're going to be kicking it off with Chapter 2. With Dr. Mike Strickland, and then Bob Braswell will be presenting his work. And I wanted to read the bio information for both of them as by way of introduction. Also, maybe before I do that, I'd love to take just a special moment of pause and celebration and honoring for Mike because of the Stevenson Award. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Sue, maybe to speak a little bit about that.
All right. Well, it is an honor for me to mention and talk about how Mike Strickland was selected for the Stevenson Award. Jim Rhodes wanted to do it too, and he couldn't be here because he's in class. He was so excited that he was all ready to go, and then he really realized that he couldn't attend today because he's in class. So he wrote something up, and I'll just read what he wrote. I first met Mike Strickland roughly 30 years ago at a Q conference in Columbia, Missouri, and I have enjoyed reconnecting with Mike at each Q conference. For many years, Mike taught journalism and Q to students at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and since his retirement from Nebraska, Mike has spread the gospel of Q to students and colleagues at the Federal University of Piau in Brazil. I hope I said that right.
POE.
POE? No, I don't do Portuguese yet. Many of you know Mike through his PCQ program and his participation in I4S. Mike has previously been the keynote speaker at the Q conference and is this year's recipient of the Stevenson Award, the highest honor awarded by I4S Society. The Stevenson Award is, of course, named for the innovator of Q methodology, William Stevenson, who is a direct mentor to Mike. Mike is well-deserved recipient of this award. In addition to his many contributions to Q and I4S, what stands out to me about Mike is twofold: his contributions, which make us think deeper about subjectivity and the decisions we make concerning Q methodology, and two, his encouragement of young scholars and not so young in their use of Q methodology. He is always willing to listen to you about your project and offer helpful advice. And I'll say that everybody on Zoom Q is well aware of that. When it came time to organize a fetch script to honor Professor Brown, Mike Strickland was an obvious choice to contribute. Speaking for the editors, we were thrilled that Mike graciously agreed to contribute to this project, and today you will hear about his important chapter, which in typical fashion will make you think more deeply about our shared interests in subjectivity.
Amazing. Thank you, Sue. And if you guys want to, you're welcome to unmute for a moment, and we'll hear this interesting round of applause and cheers, whatever you want to say. Congratulations, Mike.
Congrats. Thank you very much.
Hey, Mike, did you want to say anything?
Well, I said thank you very much. I think thank you is a big praise.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sue, for sharing that. And so I just want to read bios for Mike and Bob for those that are not as familiar with them, and then I'll hand it over to Bob after that. So Sue already did such a beautiful job introducing you, Mike, but just so that we have a little bit more backstory, Mike graduated from the University of Iowa with Ph.D. in Mass Communication and Media Studies, and then he went on to be professor at the University of Nebraska from 1977 to 2003. After retiring from the University of Nebraska, he returned to Teresina, Brazil, where he had done his teaching and research as a Senior Fullbright Scholar in 1999. And then, as he mentioned some of this before, he's the creator and owner emeritus of PCQ software. So, and then Bob is going to be presenting his chapter today, and that is this, I have it memorized here, Chapter 2, Cultivating in Brown's Garden, Remarks on Q Study Topology. And Bob's background is he's an associate professor of communication and research at Evangel University and serves as the coordinator of doctoral projects for their Doctor of Applied Intercultural Studies program. And he also serves as the Pan-Africa Theological Seminary and as Dean of Research and acting Vice Provost. And he was previously a missionary educator in Tanzania and South Africa from 2004 to 2017. So, and thank you so much, Bob, for agreeing to present today. And with that, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to speak on behalf of Mike today. He doesn't feel he has the air to give a good presentation, but I have been on the phone with him, and I know he's all there, and he could have done this given just a bit more air. But we are honored to. I am honored to be able to present this, and I'm going to share my screen. So can you confirm that you're able to see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, good. Okay.
Computer, Dad?
Different academic presentations take different forms, and sometimes people just read the paper, and that would be fine, except that it would take me at least 45 minutes just to read this. And then it would leave me confused over what I had just read. Because Mike's writing is dense. It's dense with meaning, and it's dense in some occasions with metaphor. And this is one of those occasions where he's using the metaphor of topology in a couple of different ways to make some points about Q methodology. So my plan is to, if I can get my own face out of the way of this text here, there we go. My plan is to read the first couple of pages of this and then come back to all the highlighted parts and unpack them, and then work forward from there, if that's okay. So, Cultivating in Brown's Garden, Remarks on Q Study Topology by Michael Strickland. In 1980, when Steve Brown's political subjectivity arrived, Professor Wilma Crumley and I sat at her round table at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and began to read it aloud all the way through. We too had studied with Stevenson, she at the University of Missouri, and I at the University of Iowa. So for days, the reading sessions were lively with an occasional aha as we confronted a political scientist's vision of Q methodology. Stevenson had planted the seeds of Q for factor analysts and psychologists in the study of behavior, and Steve Brown had transplanted the seedlings for a wider audience of social scientists. Reading the book is like walking with a guide through a Borgesian garden as Brown puts on display the flowering of Q theory and Q technique. When imagined from above in something like Google Earth, an image of Brown's garden would look to be a fully meshed logical network marked by numerous forking and looping paths. These paths represent time and events for Borges, and for Brown, they form communication connectors for patches and clumps of Q studies. He leads us first to the fountain that waters the garden by flowing along the forkling paths. The fountain of operancy marks the central intersection of principles and practice. And starting from that point of origin, he identifies and explains the qualities that form the roots of political subjectivity and, by extension, the roots of the study of communicability. It became the comprehensive resource for graduate students in journalism and mass communication studies at Nebraska. I want to illustrate here how the principle of operancy is preserved in a fully connected logical network topology, and thus subjectivity can be conserved throughout a Q study. And I'll do one more paragraph. A Q study approaches a subjective world via a sequence of models. The sequence begins with a conceptualization in the form of a problem, followed with a model of the language associated with that problem, which we call a concourse of ideas. A representative model of that concourse, a Q sample, is developed by the researcher to form an instrument of thought, to borrow C.S. Peirce's metaphor. A Q sort is the record of physical operations by a person playing such an instrument. Previous to sorting, the items are in a zero state. All the items are assumed to be connectable. The Q sort, once performed, is a completed entity, a singularity, whole in itself. In the ensuing analysis, we factor analyze the correlations of the Q sorts. Okay, back to the top. And I'm going to take a moment here to look at some of your faces on the screen and see if there are big question marks across any faces. The first note or highlight here is to talk about political subjectivity. Part of what Mike is trying to do in this essay, as it is part of the Festschrift, is to honor Stephen Brown and in particular to track the way the book Political Subjectivity has impacted him and his work, his output, and that of many others of us as well. Political Subjectivity, if there's anyone who hasn't read it, I highly, highly recommend that you read it, even if you care nothing about politics, because it's not about politics, it's about subjectivity. And we care about subjectivity, and we are studying it in its various contexts. He mentions that he himself, as well as his colleague Wilma Crumley, had personally studied with Stevenson. And I just wanted to underline that Mike didn't get his understanding of Q methodology secondhand from Stephen Brown. He was a direct student of Stevenson, but even though he had been a direct student of Stevenson, Brown's book helped him to frame it, to codify it, and to apply it in ways that moved it out of the realm of psychology that Stevenson was writing for, and to see it as applicable to Mike's field, which is mass communication and journalism. And I also resonate with that. My own field is mass communication research and theory. And I'll say more about that a little farther down. Okay, Stevenson had planted the seeds of Q for factor analysts and psychologists in the study of behavior, and Steve Brown had transplanted the seedlings for a wider audience of social scientists. One of the metaphors that Mike's using throughout this paper is the idea of a garden. And Stevenson had the seeds, but Mike gives Brown the credit for moving those seeds out of just the walled garden of psychology and spreading them to a much wider audience. And all of us, I think, on the call are recipients of that. When imagined from above in something like Google Earth, an image of Brown's garden would look to be a fully meshed logical network. If you have ever looked at Google Earth, if you can imagine being zoomed out and high above a map of all the Q studies ever produced, you would see in this metaphor, you would see linkages or paths connecting all of them. And a lot of those paths would not exist except for Brown's political subjectivity. And so what Mike is helping us to visualize is that there's an interconnection among all these different applications. Okay. The fountain of operancy marks the central intersection of principles and practice. Did anybody besides me need to pause and read that a couple of times to figure out what was being said there? I highlighted this and a lot of these things, not just to share with you, but as things that I needed to go back and research in order to do the job Mike asked me to do in presenting this. He later mentions C.S. Peirce. And C.S. Peirce, in the late 1800s, was giving a logical basis for what would later become behaviorism and operationalism and empiricism, as it was elaborated by Watson and Skinner and others. The philosophical or logical roots of that were in Peirce. And Stevenson was influenced by Peirce's thought. And part of what's going on is that the field of psychology, which had been dominated by thinkers such as Freud, who were heavy on interpretation, but light on being able to show exactly what data those interpretations were based on. And Peirce is saying, and Bridgman after him, that in order for psychology to outgrow this kind of Freudian necessity of genius interpretation in order to get anywhere, and then having the whole world question whether the genius actually kicked in at that moment or was a cigar just a cigar, the issue is tying those unobservables like consciousness to observables like the difference consciousness makes in the observable world. So instead of interpretations of consciousness, you look at behaviors. All of that is getting a little bit deep, so maybe I should quickly move on. But what I'm trying to say is that there is an idea here that's governing all of Stevenson's thinking about Q, and that is there are things that we can't see, such as a rock thrown into the pond. We can't easily examine the rock, but we can see the ripples that are coming across the pond because the rock was there. And by examining the ripples, we can learn things. And it is this examining of the ripples, looking at what is observable,
It is good, but it is kind of metaphors, defining metaphors.
Okay. Am I okay?
Yep,
Yes,
yeah.
and we call it operancy.
Yes, and we call it operancy. And by the way, Pierce was before the idea of operational definitions, but operational definitions grew out of Pierce's ideas about operationism, and as did Stevenson's ideas about operancy. So if you're able to tie all that together, I hope that helps somebody. Okay. Mike was in journalism and mass communication studies at Nebraska. I feel like I should throw in here that the field of communication as a social science was just getting started. Just as psychology attempted to become a science in the mode of physics and outgrow the kind of Freudian understanding of what psychology was about, and Stevenson was a part of that, by the way. So too, communication tried to become its own field in the social sciences in the wake of World War II, where a whole line of research sprung up about how Hitler was able to use propaganda and so move great numbers of people that it resulted in a world war. So communication research was becoming a field just at the same time as this was going on, and Mike was part of that field. Okay, I've mentioned C.S. Pierce's metaphor, and if there are further questions about that, we can come back to it at the end. Here's an idea that has a bunch of connections. The Q sort, once performed, is a completed entity, a singularity, whole in itself. I recently watched a number file video. If you know what that is, number file is a YouTube channel for people who like math. And the question this particular video was asking is, how big a number do you need to think about and say out loud to be sure that nobody else in the history of the world has ever thought about this number and said it out loud? And there were some computations of the probabilities and comparison of the number of numbers available to say out loud with the number of people available to ever have thought about them. And all of this leads to the idea that you don't have to have a very big number in mind to be the first one in human history to ever really be thinking about that specific number. In the same way, a Q sort, because each individual statement can be sorted to each of a number of different slots, the total number of ways to sort a particular sort is unlikely to have ever happened before. It is a unique event. And that is a picture of what was going on in the subjectivity of the sorter at that moment, but that moment will never be repeated. If you ask that same person to sort those same statements 24 hours later, that would be a very high correlation, but there would not be an exact match, assuming that your number of statements is large enough to just make it nearly impossible for the person to even remember how he sorted it before. So a Q sort once performed takes on a kind of unique it's an object that wasn't there before, and it's a completely unique object. And it's a ripple in the pond that we can look at, and we can look at the pattern of ripples to learn a lot about those who did the sorting. Okay, we keep coming back to this word operancy, and I think I won't say more about it until we get to the end for a time of questions and answers. And there are others who can answer it better than I can anyway. Thus, to qualify as a proper Q study, all must be operant within the constraints of an appropriate theoretical model of a concourse of communication and of methodological principles as channeled by conditions of instruction. So the idea is that operancy doesn't just start at the time of sorting. In the example study that Mike writes up in this essay, a number of interviews were done in order to generate the concourse from which the Q statements were selected, the Q sample was formed, and even those answers to those interview questions are examples of operancy. So there is a rootedness in operancy from the very beginning stages. Okay. I really am feeling, even though we have said we would take some time and present first and then ask the questions later, I'm really feeling like I need to give a chance for some feedback before I go on. Otherwise, I don't know if I'm just talking to people who have lost the thread, or if we are making some progress together.
It's a good teacher.
Feel free to unmute and throw out a question if you have one.
Chat says, Bob, you are doing brilliantly, very clear. Does anyone else want to unmute and give a quick reflection, or you can put something into the chat as well? I was going to add, Bob, this is great.
Okay, thank you.
You know, I read it and I read it again, and I'm staring at the graphics and I'm thinking. And so at least for me, this is wonderful. But yeah, any other reflections?
Okay, if you guys are okay, I'm okay, so I'll continue on. Okay, the importance of Mike and his colleagues doing this study at the time he did them is that, again, that was the birth of the field of mass communication research. And I want to give you a little bit of context about what was going on in that field. The United States Air Force was flying over small towns in Nebraska and bombing them with pamphlets, and then sending in teams of researchers to go door to door to find out who had picked up a pamphlet, who had read it, who was able to give a précis of the information in the pamphlet, and to understand the flow of communication and persuasion in the small town. And again, this was in response to what they saw in World War II with the effectiveness of propaganda. So these small towns, it was the birth of Laszlo's two-step flow theory of communication. the idea that little kids were the ones who picked up the pamphlets and then brought them home, and then the parents decided whether they were going to believe what was on the pamphlet, led directly to the two-step flow of information theory that thought leaders decide which of the inputs from a variety of sources are going to be accepted by the community. And we see the two-step flow working in a different way with social media, but that's a different topic for a different day. But the issue with these small towns is that they were a hotbed of research for communication theory just at the time that this kind of research was being done by Mike. And in the Nebraska newspaper studies, they wanted to know about the citizenry's feelings about prospects for their towns for the future. And of course, they wanted to know about the prospects for small town newspapers. So that was the idea of the study that serves as an example for the other points that Mike seeks to make in this essay. And you kind of have to understand the study to understand the example. So all of these domains, family, religion, business, government, recreation, health, and education, are important in a small town. And a problem with one of these domains can affect the person's whole experience of their small town. Like it can make their subjectivity about their small town positive or negative if there's a particular issue with any one of these. So the concourse was created by doing interviews about each of these different domains. So Mike asks the question, well, why did we develop a concourse for each town? Are these not subsets of a larger statewide concourse? The answer to this second question is a simple yes. That obviously you could have one concourse and let everybody sort it from all these different towns. But the issue of what the concourse should be, or what the sample at least should be for a particular small town, depends on what's going on in that particular small town. And so if you want operancy to rule so that you're not imposing a researcher convenient one concourse fits all kind of approach on these small towns that are all different, you can go the direction that Mike went and let operancy rule the day and say, whatever emerges from the interviews in that town will create the structure for the Q sorting to be done in that town. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so instead of having one of these arrays, he's got one of these arrays for each of the small towns to be studied. And that was one of my questions the first time I read this was, why did he do that? But the answer is rooted, again, in operancy. He gives an example, a conversation in a sporting goods store that contained this exchange. This is a nice little town, says somebody in the town. To which the businessman replied, no, Carnation is a very progressive town. And here you see the resident who wants to just enjoy living in a small town environment has a view that is a bit irritating to a businessman who wants to grow business, who wants to see the town grow and his business grow as a result. So just not just a nice little town, it's a progressive town. Okay. The Q samples ranged from 48 to 52 items because there were Q samples for each of the various towns. And they were balanced with positive and negative items and composed of statements about aspects of each social institution, each of those, what I was calling domains in the earlier diagram. They differed in that statements came from each town. Okay. And then he gives what is almost an aside, but it stays with the theme of topology. But Mike gives an aside about comparing Q and R topologies. And he has figures 3 and 4, which I'm going to quickly show on the screen and then go back to my note there. This is a topology for a Q study, and this is a topology for the same domains studied using Likert questionnaires. And the note I've added, when Mike talks about our method, he's using that as a shorthand that may need to be unpacked for some. That shorthand was introduced in Brown's book, and it may have even occurred before that in some of Stevenson's writings that I'm not thinking of right now. It seems like it may already be there. But our method as the foil for Q method is something we could talk a long time about to understand all that's packed into that phrase. But we don't need the whole discussion to understand this, because the difference in operancy between just answering a series of Likert items versus doing a sort, which requires placing each item relative to every other item, is the focus here. So if you have to place each item relative to every other item, this is the picture that emerges. Each one has to be understood relative to the others. Whereas if you only have to strongly agree to strongly disagree about each of these in turn, this is the topology that we're looking at. And so as he goes past this issue of topology in another way, Mike kind of takes a sidestep to talk about topology with regard to R method versus Q method, showing the relative richness of R method and the relative sparseness of information of doing it the other way. There's an argument here about in our method, the researcher is kind of controlling what it's possible to get back. And so one might ask, well, what about a condition of instruction in Q? Is that not a control? And Mike makes the point, yes, but it's a condition of instruction is a boundary rather than a filter. So it's a boundary of what we're going to, what is the topic that we're talking about, but it is not limiting what the researcher can get back in the same way that the researcher asking a set of Likert questions does. And then the next analogy to topology is this idea that if you had each of the items in a Q sort represented by a dot, you would start out with all of the dots at a 0 state. Nobody has responded to any of the dots yet. They're all neutral. And you could represent that looking down from above topologically as kind of a polar graph as all of them at a 0 state. So that's at rest. If we scroll down, we can see the same array, actually with a numbered grid here. I don't know if you can see my cursor when I use it to point like that, but you actually have +1 to +5 and -1 to -5 in the same way as you would sort each statement onto a Q grid. And so it would be possible then to graph the Q sort by showing where each of these dots moved from its at-rest state at 0 to its sorted state. Okay. Now, because this comes here in the description, I'm going to interrupt the polar graph discussion for a moment to talk about PCQ. The NNS project was expected to produce 500 Q sorts, and yet the mainframe program that Mike was using to do the analysis was no longer going to be available to him. So Mike did that which was necessary and constructed PCQ for personal computers to do the analysis. Now, at about the same time, I was getting into Q for the first time, and I got into Q by reading Brown's book. And like Mike, I did not have access to a mainframe or computer program that would do the analysis for me. So I actually wrote a series of macros in MathCAD to do my first Q study. And so I feel like Mike and I have a lot in common on this, because we both got all our information about how to do that from the back of Stephen Brown's book. It was very clear, very detailed. All that we needed to know to make a program that actually worked was contained in that book. So after that interruption to talk about software, here's an example of that polar plot with each of the statements moved off of the 0 ring to wherever it happened to be moved by the particular sorter. This was the Peony City Manager's Q sort. And if you just kind of look at the overall shape of this, you see, kind of a wing over here and a wing over here and maybe some antennae over here. You can compare that just visually with this very different plot. And it helps to know which is statement number 1. On here, statement number 1 was given a very high positive ranking. On this one, it was a very low negative ranking. And so he has circled statement 1 so that we can kind of line these up in our minds and compare the two. But if we just wanted to look at individual subjectivity, such a polar chart might be all we needed. But Q studies look at shared subjectivity, and for that, we use factor analysis. Comparing just 2 such polar plots quickly becomes hard work. You quickly have to exert some energy to try to line these up mentally so that you get an idea of where they differ and where they are alike. And you don't accidentally just rotate them to fit each other, because that would be completely confusing which statements they were agreeing and disagreeing with. So comparing even just two such plots quickly becomes hard work, and the number of sorts involved in a typical study calls for the help of computerized factor analysis to help us see the patterns. So Mike says, recall that factor analysis answers the question, which sorts go together? I would say, while that is a completely true statement, it's an incomplete statement, because the cool thing about factor analysis is it does more than that at the same time. If we were just answering the question, which sorts go together, it would be enough to use discriminant analysis or some other multivariate procedure that only looks at that. But what factor analysis gives us in addition to that is, at the same time as it's telling us which sorts go together, it tells us which statements are underlying which sorts go together. And it is the analysis of those patterns among the statements that really give us the information to go forward with our interpretation. Okay, I see that I'm running out of time. Let me just quickly highlight some of these scatter plots. I love to look at the scatter plots in a Q study. They tell me so much, and I know that it is possible these days to use software that just does Verimax for you, and you can get the printout without ever looking at a scatter plot. But I think that's a mistake, because looking at the scatter plot tells me so much about this. For instance, this factor on the horizontal axis is not a factor that represents a whole lot of people. This factor on the vertical axis is because this is unrotated first factor that we're looking at here. This represents the overall agreement of everybody in town about their little town. But this factor over here, something else is going on. And one way to look at this would be to say this represents some disagreement. The horizontal axis represents some disagreement within the agreement, some differences of emphasis within the agreement. Or we could do what is normally done and redraw these axes something like between 30 and 45 degrees from where they are now, so that this clump of points would be right about here, and that would be Verimax rotation. But I will have a chance to talk about more scatter plots when I get to my my presentation of my chapter, but I just wanted to throw that in. Mike also agrees with me that it's important to look at the scatter plots, and he can show you what's going on by looking at the scatter plots. And I think it's 100% worthwhile on any Q study. Even if you don't do judgmental rotation, sometimes you have to tell the computer you want to do judgmental rotation in order to see any scatter plots. So tell the computer you want to do judgmental rotation and use the opportunity to learn what's going on in your data. Okay, that's an aside. Because I'm out of time, I'm just going to go straight to the end here and then open it up for questions. There it is. Okay, reprise and a promise. But what would a repeat of the Nebraska newspaper studies teach us? As we might ponder this question, we should not forget that operancy, like time, is not only indeterminate and iterational, but also dynamic and changing. So the ripples that come from the rock thrown in the pond are never holding still. When we collect a Q sort, that's like taking a photo of the ripples at one moment in time. But we have to realize that that's just one moment in time and that the ripples kept moving. And then finally, part of what Mike was doing in this whole essay was what he calls a valedictory for his admiration of Stephen Brown's work, and particularly the way the book, Political Subjectivity, provided and continues to provide the Q community with a working vocabulary of continuing benefit. And I myself would like to end on that note as well, underlining the value of that tremendous work. And now I will stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
You deserve that kind of consideration that you gave to.
Love to give a round of applause if you like, silent or unmuted. So thank you very, very much. I feel like I could do that for 2 more hours. I'm just a little long, but let's open up the space for questions, reflections, and you can just unmute yourself if you want to jump in, or you can raise your hand, however you like. Just go ahead, encourage you to, and you can also put anything you like into the chat.
And Mike is here, so maybe we should let Mike give a rebuttal first.
That's true. Mike, go ahead, Mike.
Well, Braswell, I'm sure glad I invited you. Thank you.
Thank you,
for
sir.
doing that.
Thank you, sir.
One of the most thoughtful members of our community that we don't hear from very often is Irv Goldman. Irv and I were students together at Iowa, and we shared many things. Irv, may I ask you how you respond to that?
Yes, I recall the first meeting of I4S when they were going to call it this, the scientific study of subjectivity, and being from Canada, I insisted that they put the international.
Yes, you did.
The international prefix. Yeah, well, anyway, congratulations, Mike. And I don't think I've ever met my Bob Braswell. The only other person I know of this group is going back many years ago is Steve Brown. And we go back many years. So, and we're still in touch. So anyway, Mike, I hope all is well with you, and congratulations on a great chapter. I enjoyed reading it. I bought the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading your chapter. Seeing you brings back many memories of the old days, of the old Iowa days.
Oh yes.
It's unfortunate Rob Logan didn't attend this. Was he here?
I don't think so.
No. Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
He does plan to come visit me, and I appreciate that. Rob Logan is one of the first people I met at Iowa, and he has proved out to be one of the most active of all the scholars in our group.
Oh, really? You know, even though I was a student of Stevenson's, I never ever took a course with him. The way I met Stevenson was at Mike's thesis dissertation defense. And I started chatting with him, and I had an interest in psychology and so on and so forth. So in those years, Al Talbot introduced us, and I did a proposal for a dissertation, and I ended up taking trips to Columbia, Missouri from Iowa City. I would do monthly trips where Stevenson would greet me and have lunch and so on. But Stevenson was very punctual. 1 o'clock, I'd have to be there. 4 o'clock, out the door.
Thank you.
For that story. Good story.
Thank you. I'd like to make sure that the newcomers are not intimidated by all the old timers, and specifically ask for any questions or comments from those who have not been in Q methodology for 20 years or more.
Great idea, Bob.
You can also type it into the chat as well if that's a little easier.
I'll just mention something quickly. I appreciated it's Joe from Oxford Brookes. I appreciated your point about the concourse, because one of the things that I've had trouble with is explaining how it's not limiting the research by the statements being the choice of the researcher, and so that the way that obviously Mike's written it and the way you've gone on to describe it has been really helpful for me to get my words around it as well. But the next time I'm trying to justify a Q to my colleagues who know very little about it. So thank you about that.
Right. Thanks for that comment. Somebody else had
Commented into the chat from Joanna. What might viewing the sample in a polar view reveal about interpretations of the sample in a pyramid view? What is seen afresh?
Well, remember that when you're looking at the polar view, you're looking at one sort. And there are multiple ways of looking at that one sort. I think I remember writing something to the Q method list one time about using Chernoff faces to represent those sorts. And I think I got a very, very kind response from Stephen Brown, said something about, but what about factor analysis? Which he was reminding me that there's a difference between looking at one sort and understanding what's going on in that one sort versus looking for the shared subjectivity of multiple sorts. What is that latent variable that's underlying why these people sorted in similar ways? And so the polar view is limited in that it's only showing us one picture. And usually what we're going after is to understand the shared subjectivity that underlines clumps of similar sorts. And okay, I'll stop there. Yes.
May I take a stab at that question?
Certainly.
A few weeks ago, I looked at my dissertation. It has 2 Q studies in it. The factors still live. Factors are still there. They're not the same. I can't say they've grown up, but I can say that they're the same. They present the same fundamental thrust, and the subjectivity issue has not changed. I used to worry a lot about the ruin of traditional mass media, and I still do to some extent. But what has replaced it is really so much more open, so much more available, so much more of everything, and somehow those factors are still there.
Thank you.
So
Mike.
that's what
I was going to go in another. I was going to go in another way in answering that and talk about intensive case studies where you're doing multiple sorts over time with the same person. And the idea is a single sort at a single point in time does not really represent that person's point of view once and for all about whatever the topic is. It represents that person's point of view at that moment. If you then go back to that same person, say the director of a mission, in an example from my own experience, if you go to that director and you ask about the same topic multiple times, then the factor analysis will give you what is stable and what is underlying the correlations among the different snapshots taken at different moments in time.
And that's the value of it. If anything, it increases.
Yeah.
I mean, a Q study is kind of a precious thing. Don't drop them. Keep up with them.
We are right at the hour mark. And so I wanted to offer a soft close for anyone that needs to leave or had only planned for an hour, since we have to just do an hour, but also wanted to create space for more questions and mingling and spending more time in the space. So yeah, just for anyone, because there might be a trickling of people leaving, just wanted to take a moment to pause here and say thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. I feel like we could go for another hour just listening and asking questions and absorbing. And so, yeah, if people want to put any messages or things into the chat or just unmute and express appreciation, just want to take a pause for that. So Mike and Bob, thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you.
And so with that, people are still welcome to stay. I'll keep the room open and we can keep going. Bob and Mike, how are you guys? How's your sleep? You're here?
Yeah, I'm willing to stay a little longer. So if there are additional questions, I feel, thank you for the relief of feeling that I'm not holding people captive. But
I know it's the first day of classes for some people. So yeah, so soft close there. Thanks for everyone who was able to come. And then yeah, we can still keep going for anyone. And yeah, there's a couple of nice messages in the chat. Bye, Rita. Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right, Bob or Mike, back to you. I liked your strategy of picking on people to respond.
I just saw an unforgettable name, Desiree. I'm glad she's here.
Oh, I remember Desiree, yes.
Yes, Desiree. We have this group from the field of medicine that are really, they've been really good members and participants, particularly from the Chicago area. Very important.
Nabil has his hand up. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, all. I'm back in UK, so I don't know what the time is, but I'm a PhD student in my third year. I have collected my data actually in the Q methodology, and I have everything. I started doing the analysis and things like that. And I ended up with the two factors, like sorting 40 statements for 54 participants.
Wow.
So, and it was
really
quite
cool.
nice, actually, experience. But unfortunately, I mean, it's not unfortunately, I mean, half of them, I think, the Q sort wasn't not significant, couldn't load on any factors. And thus, I'm not sure what the issue is. And I was looking for the community of the Q to present my issue and to see what they can tell about me, anything that's up in my mind.
Well, the first thing I would say, if I may jump in, is that it's not a tragedy. It's quite normal to have mixed cases where a handful of people define factor one, and a handful of people define factor two. And if you look at the scatter plot, there are a bunch of people right in between those people that define factor one and those people that define factor two that are mixed cases. They agree partly with the factor one guys and partly with the factor two guys. And so the fact that they have more nuanced and less clear-cut opinions is not a tragedy. It just means that their views need to be understood as a combination of the two factors.
No, thank you. That's pretty nice. I mean, I can tell like from the analysis before.
May I add something to Bob's words, which I agree with? Suppose you have a lot of people in the middle. In other words, their scores are lower than the minimum to be associated with a factor. What's going on there? Well, I think that probably the most, I guess I'll say obvious. So that's an obvious sign that they're not on the concourse. Stevenson used that terminology, not being on the concourse. They weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about something else. And so therefore, they didn't show to be significantly associated with either factor or with what Bob correctly can call a mixed factor.
That's definitely, I think I can sense now. I can get it like through the interview. I actually done it through online. Through the interview it was really hard to get their opinion and to get what they're thinking about. They have totally different opinion when they did the sorting actually, and that makes like a really clear idea about that issue.
If I could add something. Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, keep up the good work. Q is not easy.
Yes, it is not. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
But I would point out also that those people who are mixed cases with a different rotation, they would become pure cases.
Yes.
Right.
And the people who are now pure cases would become mixed cases. Yeah. And there's nothing sacrosanct about, whether it's the Varamax solution or whatever it might be, that there may be other solutions, just like changing the resolving power of a microscope. Yes. What's in the distance all of a sudden gets clear, and what's in the foreground gets blurred. And then you change the resolving power, and then what's in the foreground gets distinct, and what's in the background gets fuzzy.
We'll have more on that next month.
Yes, I'm sure we will. I know. Are you on next month?
Yes, so. I will be. It is nice talking to you. Thank you all. Thank you.
I would just chime in on Mike's comment that I think reinforces the importance of understanding the condition of instruction and making sure that researchers do all they can at the start to orient the sorters to the task ahead of them by giving them a really clear boundary on what you are asking them to reflect on and think about. So I hope I'll return to that when my turn comes around in this series. But I think, thank you, Mike, for making that connection to not on the concourse.
It's such a pleasure to hear a New Zealander's accent.
Yeah.
Even an American who's a New Zealander.
That's true.
Well, likewise to hear you, Mike. and Bob. This was a real treat.
It was.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say again what an honor I felt to be asked by Mike to present this chapter. So thank you, Mike, for that.
Thank you.
Well,
I know.
thank you, Bob. I just want to say once again, winning the Stevenson Award, I was absolutely shocked. Absolutely shocked. What's interesting is the week before, my faculty in PLE named me professor honoris causa, which there's nothing higher than that. I mean, you know, I've had two really, really good weeks.
Yeah,
Even though my
super.
reading is getting more and more shallow every day. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for allowing me to talk. I appreciate it very much.
I
wanna
just
say
wanted to say hello to everybody. I'm not sure that too many of you will remember me, but I was a Don Brenner and Keith Sanders trainee in Q at the University of Missouri, and was there for the first Q conferences. Mike and Diane, know, and Amanda probably too. I saw you in England. But it was fun, kind of remembering some of these things. And of course, Rob Logan remains a good friend of mine too, and he's helped me with a couple of things. So it's great to collaborate. And I think sometimes, and Steve, you and I collaborated on something a while back, a long time ago. But I would love to see more collaboration going on too. It just kind of relieves some of the burden. And one other thing I was thinking about was, and I don't remember who created it, but Keith always had me using Quantal to do all of the Q sort analyses. Any of you remember Quantal? There was a student who had created that, I think, and I don't remember the details.
The reason why I wrote PCQ is our computer center announced they were no longer going to support Quantal.
Yeah, well, I don't know that it was exactly
The
supported
author,
at the University of Missouri either. But.
The author was a colleague of Al Talbot's named Von Tubergen.
Okay. So anyway, that
It's a
was the
good
good old
program.
days,
Yeah.
Mike, I'd like to thank you for doing PCQ. That was quite an advance over Quantal. Quantal, to be fair, was ported to the PC in about 1980, give or take a year or two. But it was still difficult to use because it was still using the IBM language, and it was yours is so much easier, and it lends itself to analysis so much better.
Thank you so much, Ron.
I think I still have the first copy of PCQ when it was on a floppy disk.
Yes, it was.
Wow.
Yeah, 3.5-inch floppy. Yeah. And if I don't have it, it's because I gave it to the Center for the History of Psychology. They may have it. I can't remember whether I've got it or whether the Center for the History of Psychology has it.
Steve, when I sat down to write this essay, it was the easiest thing I've ever written because I remembered so well all the different stages in my development as a Q researcher that came out of that experience. So I want to especially thank you once again. You set us up. Thank you.
Yeah, I should also mention that I was directed to Stephen's book when I was working on my things. So it was quite helpful to me too in really understanding a lot of the aspects of Q. So I'm very grateful to all of you who carried on Stevenson's ideas and work to a great extent.
Well, when
And
you
I'm
look
going to
back
have
at
to
all
go.
of
I'm
them,
one of those people whose classes started today. So I will see you all hopefully next week.
Goodbye.
when you look back on the history of factor analysis, Burt, Spearman, Ising, and so forth, those are all great names and we remember them and so forth. But Stevenson's ideas are the only ones that are persevering.
Yes.
I mean, what Spearman was trying to do is not at all what modern factor analysts are doing, and Stevenson complained about that. But here's all this work now with subjectivity and so forth. Those are Stevenson's ideas. Those are going strong.
Yes.
And so Stevenson is eclipsing all of those who came before.
As well he should.
As well he should. As well he should.
Well, I am grateful for this opportunity. I want to say thank you again, not only to Mike, but to Miku, and for putting this together. But I'm going to sign off and I will see you next time.
You did a marvelous job, Bob.
Thank you, Steve.
Really good.
Thank you so much.
Nice work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm going to sign off too and catch my breath. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Good to see everybody. Been terrific.
Great to see everybody. Great to see you, Mike.
And
Thank
for
you,
others,
everyone.
thanks.